The international, national, and local events that marked the college years of the classes of 1969 and 1970 possessed an intensity which I believe has not been matched by any period since. Indeed, one would have to go back nearly 70 years to the generation of college students enrolled during World War II to find a time of equivalent momentousness and passion. The events of those times affected each of us differently, but affect us they did. If you are like me, you revisit them in your mind almost daily, but many of you may not have the inclination or the occasions, as I do, to think back very often. So it seemed to the panelists, given the topic of discussion for this gathering, it would be worthwhile to refresh your memories with a few headlines, local, national, and international, from those tumultuous years. So many noteworthy things happened that any selection is bound to be arbitrary. I went for events that I felt impacted the largest number of people at each of the three levels, or that commanded media attention, but even so, I have had to leave out a great many important ones. Please help us remember others during the discussion. Here then are some of the headlines put into my own words, arranged by year, though not necessarily chronologically within each year. 1965. The Oscar for Best Picture goes to The Sound of Music. Some of the sounds of music that reached #1 on the pop charts, like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan, In the Midnight Hour, Wilson Pickett, Yesterday, The Beatles, The Sounds of Silence, Simon and Garfunkel, and it was also the year the Grateful Dead had their beginning in San Francisco. The year begins on an optimistic note. President Johnson declares the government's war on poverty. But in February, Malcolm X is shot. Through February and March, Selma, Alabama is the focus of civil rights demonstrations. Martin Luther King and 770 others are arrested. Alabama State Police attack marchers, and LBJ federalizes National Guardsmen to protect them on the way to Montgomery. On March 8th, 3,500 U.S. troops land at Da Nang, the first deployment of U.S. combat forces in Vietnam. Teach-ins opposing the war are broadcast to over 100 college campuses, but nevertheless, Congress authorizes the use of ground troops in direct combat if South Vietnam requests it. By July, 125,000 U.S. forces are in Vietnam, and Walter Rostow, the National Security Advisor, predicts the Viet Cong will collapse within weeks. On August 12th, violent race riots break out in the Watts section of Los Angeles. Nearly 4,000 people are arrested. In October, anti-war rallies are held in 4 U.S. cities. Allen Ginsberg introduces the term flower power, even as marchers in Berkeley are attacked by members of the Hells Angels motorcycle gang as being un-American. Texas voters elect Barbara Jordan to the state Senate, the first black senator since 1883. As proposed by Adlai Stevenson, Congress approves a foreign aid budget equivalent to 1% of the GNP. By 1995, that figure was 1/10 of 1%. Congress also requires cigarette packages to carry the label "Caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health." 1966, Procter & Gamble introduces the first disposable diaper pads. The first Star Trek episode airs. Medicare begins. The U.S. Army establishes official military brothels within the perimeter of the 1st Cavalry Division base camp, the 1st Infantry Division, and the 4th Cavalry Division. Betty Friedan becomes the first president of the National Organization of Women. Alabama Governor George Wallace signs into law a bill forbidding Alabama schools from complying with the Federal Office of Education's desegregation plan. Stokely Carmichael becomes the head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, advocating a more militant direction and leading SNCC away from the mainstream civil rights movement. Race riots occur in Cleveland, Chicago, and Atlanta, among other cities. Edward Brooke is elected as the nation's first black senator. Excuse me. Chairman Mao announces the great proletarian cultural revolution, and the People's Republic of China detonates its first nuclear bomb. 3 weeks later, I don't think there's a connection here, the Beatles give their last public concert in San Francisco. Number one top 40 hits include Wild Thing by the Troggs and Ballad of the Green Berets by Sergeant Barry Sadler. Among other number one hits that year, Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys, You Keep Me Hanging On by the Supremes, These Boots Are Made for Walkin' by Nancy Sinatra. Summer Wind, the number one pop hit of the year, is by her father. By the end of the year, 389,000 U.S. troops are in Vietnam. Best Picture for 1966 is A Man for All Seasons, about Sir Thomas More's opposition to his king for the sake of his conscience. 1967. In June, the Supreme Court rules unconstitutional any law against interracial marriage, overturning a dozen state laws in the process. In October, Thurgood Marshall becomes the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Carl Stokes is elected mayor of Cleveland, and Richard Hatcher of Gary, Indiana, the first African-American mayors of major U.S. cities. Race riots occur that year in Cincinnati, Tampa, Newark, Buffalo, Memphis, Detroit, Milwaukee, Cairo, Illinois, Durham, North Carolina, and Cambridge, Maryland, causing over 100 deaths and leading to the arrest of thousands. In the Middle East, the Six-Day War between Israel and a coalition of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq results in the Israeli occupation of Jerusalem's Old City, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. With covert U.S. assistance, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi is crowned Shah of Iran. In Bolivia, the government captures Che Guevara and his men. The next day, Che is executed for attempting to incite a revolution. In Vietnam, over 500,000 American troops are engaged in the war effort. During October, 70,000 protesters gather at the Lincoln Monument and later walk to the Pentagon, where they sing and chant in an effort to levitate the building, turn it orange, and in that way exorcise the evil spirits that are perpetuating the war. 7 Grinnell College students participate in the rally. Back on campus, a multi-day convocation brings together a spectacular array of intellectuals to discuss American life and culture, science, and the arts. They include Ralph Ellison, author of The Invisible Man, Marshall McLuhan, media scholar, Robert Rauschenberg, artist, Fred Friendly, former president of CBS News, and James Van Allen, physicist. An anti-war rally during the convocation draws over 500 students to ARH Auditorium. You might remember part of this space, to hear anthropologist Ashley Montague call for the impeachment of President Johnson. It is also homecoming weekend. Music for the homecoming ball in Darby on Saturday night. Gary Giddens, thank you, is provided by Louis Armstrong and his band. The events of the weekend culminate on December morning with an address by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., remaining awake during a revolution, to an overflow crowd in Darby Gymnasium estimated at 4,000. Other events on campus. Students engage in sometimes heated discussions about the nature of campus residential life and the notion that the college stands in loco parentis. The president of the Council of House Presidents resigns over pressures for, quote, pressures for total neglect of the rules on North Campus. The president's medallion on display in Burling Library is stolen and replaced by a strand of gumdrops and a rubber scorpion. An editorial in the Scarlet and Black laments the poor relations that exist between the college students and the town, urging tolerance on both sides. The musical Hair opens off-Broadway. The Beatles release the album Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. Naomi Sims is the first African-American model to appear on a U.S. magazine cover. The number one top 40 hit of the year is Lulu's To Sir With Love. Aretha Franklin's Respect is the number one rhythm and blues hit. Jimi Hendrix records Purple Haze. Best picture for the year is In the Heat of the Night with Sidney Poitier and Rod Steiger. 1968. 1968 is especially marked by violence and death. In January, 70,000 North Vietnamese troops launched the Tet Offensive. A day later, the execution-style killing of a Viet Cong by a South Vietnamese security officer is captured on film and becomes an iconic image of the war. In February, the press quotes an unnamed U.S. major as saying about the community, the town of Ben Tre, it became necessary to destroy the town to save it. In March, U.S. forces kill 347 Vietnamese civilians at My Lai. In April, Martin Luther King is assassinated. In May, Bloody Monday marks violent student protests in Paris. In June, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. In August, Soviet troops invade Czechoslovakia, ending the Prague Spring. In Chicago, police attack anti-war demonstrators at the Democratic National Convention. During 1968, 16,592 American military personnel die in Vietnam, the largest yearly total of the war. Meanwhile, for others, life goes on. Harper Valley PTA was a #1 hit, along with Hey Jude by the Beatles, Hello, I Love You by the Doors, Heard It Through the Grapevine by Marvin Gaye, and Mrs. Robinson by Simon and Garfunkel. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is signed by the US, USSR, and a large number of other countries. North Korea is not among the signatories. The science fiction film 2001, A Space Odyssey, portrays violence in our evolutionary past and sinister technology in our present, but holds out hope for the future. It is not nominated for Best Picture, which is won by Oliver. In 2002, critics rank A Space Odyssey among the top 10 films of all time. 1969. 1969 includes some noteworthy firsts. The first moonwalk, Neil Armstrong, the first in vitro fertilization of a human egg, the first message sent over ARPANET, the forerunner of the internet, the first banning of DDT, the formation of the Walmart Corporation, the first draft lottery since World War II, and the first U.S. troop withdrawals from Vietnam, as President Nixon begins the process of Vietnamization with the goal of building up the strength of the South Vietnamese armed forces to allow them to defend their own country. War protests continue and grow, mingled with issues of free speech. The Supreme Court issues a 7-2 decision in Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District, ruling that the First Amendment applies to public schools. The so-called Tinker test is still in use by courts today. The Weatherman faction takes over Students for a Democratic Society, further radicalizing the organization. The Stonewall riots in New York City begins the gay rights movement. The 1969 movies Easy Rider, The Wild Bunch, Midnight Cowboy, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid all end with death. Midnight Cowboy wins Best Picture, the only time an X-rated movie has won. On the other hand, the Woodstock Festival celebrates life and social protest with the music of Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Joan Baez, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, and Jefferson Airplane. 2 months later, the Rolling Stones host the Altamont Free Concert. Marred by violence, it is seen as the death of the 60s. 1969 also contains a last, the Beatles' last public appearance, impromptu, on the roof of Apple Records, which is broken up by police. But it is also the year of the first single released by a Beatle, John Lennon's Give Peace a Chance, which becomes the anthem of the anti-war movement. 1970, 3 new technologies begin to impact daily life: liquid crystal display, barcodes, and the floppy disk. Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix die of drug overdoses. Mick Jagger is fined 200 pounds for possession of cannabis. King Hussein of Jordan suppresses a Palestinian revolt and expels the PLO from the country. On April 22nd, the nation celebrates the first Earth Day. On May 1st, U.S. troops invade neutral Cambodia. On May 4th, Ohio National Guard troops fire on a crowd of anti-war demonstrators at Kent State University, killing 4. 2 weeks later, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young record Ohio. Oh dear. I was going to check the exact date, but I forgot to do it. On May something, the Grinnell College administration announces the cancellation of all official college functions for the remainder of the semester. Also in 1970, the Beatles release The Long and Winding Road, and Simon and Garfunkel release Bridge Over Troubled Waters. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the season of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us.
Well, thanks for inviting me to participate. As the years go by, increasing fraction of the reunion participants are my ex-students, and we really look forward to the opportunity to see them. I came to the college in 1962 as assistant professor of chemistry, the youngest member of the expanded chemistry department. My office was a small windowless cubicle created in the corner of the physical chemistry lab, since existing offices in the 1952 science building were all occupied. Needless to say, I've seen quite dramatic changes at the college over those 4 years. So I'd like to use this time to highlight a few specific comparisons between Grinnell College of 1968 that many of you knew and the Grinnell College of 2008. And I happen to have the numbers for those years, so I'll use those rather than 69 and 2009. My limited comparison will focus on the people, faculty and students, the facilities, and the academic programs of the college, unlike the worldview that we have just heard summarized by John very well.
Chemical bonds.
How's that? First of all, the college is still a small coeducational residential college as it was in 1968. Student enrollment has increased significantly, but not as fast as faculty size, so the student-faculty ratio has decreased substantially. Not surprisingly, the total cost of tuition and fees has also increased substantially. In case you have trouble recognizing this, the six of us on the panel, I prepared this composite illustration from yearbooks of the period to remind you of all of who we were then. None of us is immune to the effects of the passage of time, so we might expect to look a little grayer and more wrinkled. But I think the spending of a career working with college-age students has a way of slowing down the aging process and keeping us all a bit younger than many of our contemporaries, at least. Another reason I assembled this composite of portraits was to emphasize that the makeup of the faculty and administration of Grinnell College has changed substantially in 40 years. In assembling a panel of faculty members who were here in 1968, you had very few women to choose from. The gender imbalance was particularly acute in the physical sciences and mathematics, as this 1968 picture of the chemistry department faculty with one of the 5 members on leave shows. The all-male chemistry faculty attracted predominantly male majors to the chemistry department. Significant exception being Mary Sue home. Here are the chemistry graduates of the class of 1968. It's a bit extreme, but not atypical. Nancy Linder was the only woman among the 20 chemistry graduates that year. The dramatic contrast between the situation in 68 and 2008 is best illustrated by comparing these pictures with that of the combined chemistry graduates and faculty of 2008, 40 years later. First of all, the black and white has given way to color, so that the class of this picture taken at the end of the year last year on the eve of commencement showed 10 chemistry faculty, 20 senior majors, along with John Kennedy, University of Iowa surgeon and Grinnell alum, who is getting an honorary degree. The student group is nearly equally divided by gender, 11 women, 9 men. Significantly, the faculty is also nearly equally divided, 4 women and 6 men. Among the physics graduates in 1968 were 3 African American women, a situation almost certainly unique among high-quality liberal arts colleges anywhere in the country. Students and faculty are the heart of the college, but the facilities are also important, and the facilities for science instruction and research are also substantially better than they were in 1968, or in the temporary cubicle that I occupied in 1962. The Hall of Science in 1968 included the substantial addition that was finished in 1966, in which doubled the space available to the 3 departments, biology, chemistry, and physics, that called the building home. Another major addition in the 80s extended the building still further east along the railroad tracks. That addition provided space for mathematics and psychology departments, which were previously housed elsewhere on campus, formalizing a change in divisional structure. Well, the further modifications and additions made in 2 phases over the past 10 years have culminated in the magnificent structure that we enjoy today. It houses the 3 science departments of 1968, psychology department, Department of Mathematics and Statistics, the more recently developed computer science department, and the substantial modern science library. The building provides outstanding laboratory, classroom, and office space, as well as modern equipment and space for student and faculty researchers. Briefly on this, in 1968, the faculty adopted several changes in faculty organization and graduation requirements. Most of the changes had been recommended by a committee chaired by economics professor Bob Haveman, and which historian Al Jones, French professor Morris Parslow, music professor Dick Howe, and I from chemistry also served. The changes in divisional structure have survived to this day with only minor adjustments to accommodate new programs. By contrast, the modest changes in general education requirements that were recommended and were adopted by the faculty in 1968 lasted less than 5 years before succumbing to the general turmoil of the late 60s, 70s that you all experienced and John Andelson has portrayed so well. It was gratifying to me to see that the major fields of the almost 400 graduates this year were nearly equally split among the 3 divisions: humanities, science, and social studies, with 9 independent majors to add to that. Even without specific distribution requirements, our students are well distributed across the curriculum. Well, 1968 saw the end of the decade-long general education curriculum centered around 2-semester sequence in humanities and 2-semester sequence in historical studies, with several specific requirements in science, language, and the fine arts. That's the curriculum that you in the 69, 70 put up with, I guess, or enjoyed. What emerged in the early 70s was the curriculum which replaced specific course requirements with a strong advising program, beginning with a first-year tutorial in which the tutor is also the incoming student's advisor. Though current students have much more flexibility in their course selection, the strong commitment of individual faculty members to the importance of a broad general education has fostered an atmosphere which encourages course selection in a wide range of disciplines for all our graduates. After commencement in 1968, and the summer working with Grinnell students on research projects here, Jenny and I packed up our two kids, 9-year-old Louise, who is now a science teacher, and 4-year-old Hans, and headed for Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and a year-long NSF-supported fellowship at the University of North Carolina. Mary Sue Coleman, a 1965 chemistry graduate, pursuing a PhD in biochemistry, found us a spacious house in the woods to rent from a UNC professor who was in Europe for the year. When her husband, Ken Coleman, headed off for Latin America for several months to complete his PhD research in political science, Mary Sue lived with us, sat with the kids, and shared the attractive facility she had located for us. We are all pictured here with Mary Sue. Mary Sue and Ken completed PhDs, established solid academic careers at the University of Kentucky, and Mary Sue moved into the academic administration to her current position as president of the University of Michigan. We are delighted to have them on campus and congratulate Mary Sue on her alumni award today. Well, that's about all I have to say. I did want to emphasize the improved opportunities for women in the sciences at Grinnell and elsewhere throughout the academic world is an important change over the years. I've not talked about relating these things specifically to the general turbulence. We've got background material now to discuss for 4 hours probably. But I did want to note that this is an intergenerational dialogue, and I've got a whole intergeneration here because my two grandsons are back here along with Mommy Mystery from the class of '84, my son-in-law, and my daughter Louise, and of course my wife Jenny.
As I remember, the students were protesting the fact that one of the honorary degrees was given to Curtis Tarr, who was then, I think, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force. Had just been appointed, I think. Curtis Tarr had been president of Lawrence University. So I think there were complicated reasons probably for his getting that award, and I don't really know more than that. But Al Jones's book is something that you all should know about. It's just a treasure. So and I hope it's still in the bookstore.
So what happened?
Well, a couple of students, and there's a picture in Al's book. There are a couple of students, or 3 or 4, got to the podium. Correct me if I'm wrong or vague on this. Got to the podium and took over the proceedings. The people that were on the podium, you know, the dean and the other people who were on the podium in these occasions, attempted to wrest the authority back. You know, they tried to let the thing go on. And I'm sorry if it seemed that I was trivializing the purpose or the occasion. I'm just telling you what I remember that was going through my mind, and trying to lighten up a bit, I suppose. That's what I remember, and I don't know what finally happened because of what I just told you. about, what happened to me.
I was on leave 1969-70, and consequently went to the S&B to find out what was going on. I was very interested to see that for the first semester, the S&B talked about all sorts of things, national news, what was going on the campus. There were lots of things, very important. At the convocation in September, the president and the dean, President Leggett, Dean Wall, and chair of the faculty, John Kleinsmith, spoke. John Kleinsmith took a very antagonistic position with respect to the students. He said, in effect, buzz off. That's in his speech, as it's quoted. And at the end, after having talked about the radical students, he said, sick 'em. I wonder what the response to that was by students who were there. That just floored me. Can you imagine anyone getting up today and saying things like that? I can't. But in the second semester, the paper, the S&B, went totally the other way. You had a column by William Buckley every time. You had another column on the same page by one of the leading conservatives of the day. All of the op-ed or the editorial things talked against student radicals. Apostle and Crossett were quoted almost ad nauseum in the thing. And I couldn't help but wonder what in the name of sense went on here. That shift from the first semester to the second semester. At the same time, there were some very important things going on. Burl Klottfelder in the physics department gave his proposal for the no curriculum, or the no requirements curriculum. Very little said about that, except that Beth Noble and John Crossett and the editorial attacked it virulently. That's still in effect today, as you well know, and doing us very well. Well, there were some other things in there, too. There was a long, long article by Tom Thomas, who incidentally was one of the individuals involved in the '69 takeover, on what was it, the Washington March Against Death in October. And it produced this great quote, which I have to give you. Nixon and Agnew better start shaking. Today's pig is tomorrow's bacon. Well, enough, I guess. But, well, there's one other thing. I wanted to raise the question with you, how you felt about things today, and does this information perhaps get to you? How many of you saw, it was on the 27th, just a couple days ago, an article in the New York Times that spoke about the West German policeman who shot a civilian protester that sparked the student revolt of 1968. Now, I was, yeah, okay, that's great. And the new discovery shows that he was a spy for the East German Stasi. Was the shot deliberate? He says it was not. He's still living. He says it was not. But who knows? How could you know that? And the son, and this is quoted in the article, the son of the student leader, radical leader in Germany at that time, and they burned out the history building at the University of Munich, which was still a smoking ruin when I got there, says that his father's death actually made Germany a better, more liberal place. In other words, his father had not died in vain. Can you say the same about the Kent State students?
I'm sure you can't believe that I was an administrator because I've kept my mouth shut here. 70 minutes. Administrators don't usually do that. A couple of, well, first let me continue on with John's chronology of events a little bit and point to Grinnell College more than the national scene. Why did the demonstration and the demonstrations that we were constantly dealing with in the late 60s, early 70s, right into the 80s, why did they occur? I say there's one answer. When kids come to me today, because I'm an old man around Grinnell and have a little memory, and say, why did they demonstrate back then? Why aren't we demonstrating now? Can you tell us how to get some demonstrating started? Now, let me tell you from whom that came. Some of you know, and he may be here today, but I'm not ashamed to say. Any of you remember Barry Ziggis? Yes. Barry Ziggis' son, Eli, was a student here, a very fine student, and graduated maybe 3 years ago, I guess. And Eli asked me to meet with him once and tell him how he could get some demonstrations started. And my response was, my God, Eli, talk to your dad. There were some things that happened that were omitted that I know you all experienced some of, but I was an administrator at the college from '63, and then for a couple of years I went back to the faculty, but I was a 28-year administrator at the college. And I dealt with problems from a different perspective than, of course, you as students, and of course, you as faculty. But these are things that led to these problems, I think. In 1965, drug use was increasing on campus pretty heavily. In 1968, we hired RAs based on what today it's RLC, I guess they call them, Residence Life Counselor, based on their experience in dealing with drugs. In 1968, we hired a man and his wife, Teeterman, who had been a drug counselor in Haight-Ashbury in California. And that's the reason we hired him. Turned out he was great. He was a great drug counselor, but he also was great as an administrator and became dean of students. And he probably is the longest term dean of students that the college has had in modern times. But drug use was increasing on campus in '65. Drug counselors on the staff in '69. The resident advisor program in the residence halls started developing then. And it was necessary for it to develop because co-ed housing was developed at that time. 1968, 69, we started mixing the sexes in the dormitories. And that changed the situation at Grinnell College a great deal. Number one, no students in Coles, Dibble, Smith, whatever, were being harassed, and they were no longer afraid to change from one residence hall to another. In '64, '65, I was involved in that, and probably a residence hall like Coles might have 2 kids that wanted to change to somewhere else, but they wouldn't ever express it because they didn't want to be harassed by the people who were in Coles. This happened more on North Campus than it did South, folks. But the first year that we had mixed co-ed housing on campus, we had something like 200 room changes. Just bang, like that. You find out your roommate isn't somebody you like, or the people around you on the floor, you change to something else. That opened things up a great deal for our students. Along with a Grinnell innovation, I think. dial-a-johns. Started with dial-a-johns. You could tell whether there was a man or a woman in there, and you could tell whether or not they wanted privacy, and you weren't supposed to enter. So on the door was the dial-a-john. And in 1969, the AWS and the C of HP merged. I look at the two past presidents here, Parker and Judy. They merged to be the SGA, and that was another major change at Grinnell College. In 1969, students also gained membership on some faculty standing committees, which was also another major change for our students. Another thing that has been a major change in past years is I took over as financial officer in 1969, and the college had an endowment of under $10 million. $9 million bucks is all the revenue from $9 million is all we had to run the college program. Also, something that was resolved by the Board of Trustees that's very important to the college, even more so important today than it was when it was resolved by the trustees, but they resolved to make Grinnell a truly multiracial society. And I think if our students were here today, you would see that we have a bigger multiracial mix than I ever could have anticipated back when I was dean. It would just not have been possible, and it's a wonderful thing. These were the days, '69, when the ROTC building was occupied, when we closed the college, of course, and the faculty established an open curriculum. Also, it was the time when the last passenger train passed through Grinnell. 1970 was the last passenger train going through Grinnell. Also, as an administrator, I had to deal with several different sorts of confrontations. One was the women's movement. We couldn't afford a women's counselor at the time, and so Glenn Leggett said to me, "You're going to have to take over as the advisor to the women's movement." The first thing that happened was, stupid old me coming from Iowa, I walked to the door when the student leaders, the women student leaders were waiting to have an appointment with me, and the first thing I stupidly said was, "Come on in, ladies." They didn't move an eyelash. And I realized then what an error I had made, and I changed and said, "Come on in, guys," and they jumped up and came right in. But it was at that time that Grinnell realized how important multiracial relationships were, and the college really went all out to get as many African American students here as we could. And I think the peak occurred in about '73 when we had about, maybe it was '72 or '71, but we had about 75 African American students on campus. Most of our efforts were devoted toward African American students because they were the raw material for our multicultural recruitment here in the country. But now it's not the case so much. We have fewer African American students at the college than we had then, but we have many, many more Asians and all different kinds of racial representations on campus, which I think is a wonderful thing. You can't walk down the street at Grinnell College anymore without meeting 5 different backgrounds in terms of racial background of the students. That's a fantastic thing at the college, and I thank the trustees and the prior administrations for doing this. I think Pam Ferguson made it a major objective of her administration as president. I think Jim Kissane mentioned team-taught courses. That was another thing that was a great innovation at Grinnell College, for us at any rate. It wasn't an innovation anywhere else. But we had courses that were taught by sometimes 5 or 6 people. We had a 12-credit Russian course that wasn't just Russian language. It was Russian language, Russian culture, Russian philosophy, Russian literature, and the kids that went through that 12-credit Russian course came out knowing a great deal about Russian relationships, etc. So many of these things affected the mood on campus, and as I say, I had to deal with these things from a different perspective than either a faculty member when I was a faculty member or when I was an administrator. And I worked in the administration for 5 presidents at Grinnell College. For 3 of those 5 presidents, I was the second officer of the college. And so I was involved in all of these things, and I really enjoyed, it was a problem at the time, but I enjoyed being involved in the discussions that took place to close the college in 1970. And I do want to mention one person who is no longer with us that I think was one of our great students, Andy Lowy. Led the students in 1970 and kept them from disrupting the entire place. And when I read his obituary in the Denver Post, I realized that he was a magnificent contributor also in Colorado, Denver, wherever he was. He was a trustee here and passed away about 2 years ago now, and was a great loss to the place.